AMA. Don't let appearances fool you. The taxi's radio was tuned to a classical FM broadcast. Janacek's Sinfonietta, probably not the ideal music to hear in a taxi caught in traffic. The middle-aged driver didn't seem to be listening very closely, either. With his mouth clamped shut, he stared straight ahead at the endless line of cars stretching out on the elevated expressway, like a veteran Sherman standing in the bow of his boat, reading the ominous conscience of two currents. Amame settled into the broad back seat, closed her eyes, and listened to the music. How many people could recognize Janacek's Sinfonietta after hearing just the RST few bars? Probably somewhere between very few and almost none. But for some reason, Amame was one of the few who could. Janacek composed his Little Symphony in 1926. He originally wrote the opening as a fanfare for a gymnastics festival. Amame imagined 1926 Czechoslovakia. The First World War had ended, and the country was freed from the long rule of the Habsburg dynasty. As they enjoyed the peaceful respite visiting Central Europe, people drank Pilsner beer in cafes, and manufactured handsome light machine guns. 2 years earlier, in utter obscurity, Franz Kafka had left the world behind. Soon Hitler would come out of nowhere, and gobble up this beautiful little country in the blink of an eye, but at the time no one knew what hardships lay in store for them. This may be the most important proposition revealed by history. At the time, no one knew what was coming. Listening to Janacek's music, Amame imagined the carefree wind sweeping across the plains of Bohemia, and thought about the vicissitudes of history. In 1926 Japan's Taisho emperor died, and the era name was changed to Showa. It was the beginning of a terrible, dark time in this country too. The short interlude of modernism and democracy was ending, giving way to fascism. Amame loved history as much as she loved sports. She rarely read tie-in, but history books could keep her occupied for hours. What she liked about history was the way all its facts were linked with particular dates and places. She did not envy it especially difficult to remember historical dates. Even if she did not learn them by rote memorization, once she grasped the relationship of an event to its time, and to the events preceding and following it, the date would come to her automatically. In both middle school and high school, she had always gotten the top grade on history exams. It puzzled her to hear someone say he had trouble learning dates. How could something so simple be a problem for anyone? Amame was her real name. Her grandfather on her father's side came from some little mountain town or village in Fukushima Prefecture, where there were supposedly a number of people who bore the name, written with exactly the same characters as the word for green peas and pronounced with the same 4 syllables, Aomame. She had never been to the place, however. Her father had cut his ties with his family before her birth, just as her mother had done with her own family, so she had never met any of her grandparents. She didn't travel much, but on those rare occasions when she stayed in an unfamiliar city or town, she would always open the hotel's phone book to see if there were any Aomames in the area. She had never found a single one, and whenever she tried and failed, she felt like a lonely castaway on the open sea. Telling people her name was always a bother. As soon as the name left her lips, the other person looked puzzled or confused. Miss Aomame? Yes. Just like green peas. Employers required her to have business cards printed, which only made things worse. People would stare at the card as if she had thrust a letter at them bearing bad news. When she announced her name on the telephone, she would often hear suppressed laughter. In waiting rooms at the doctor's or at public OCES, people would look up at the sound of her name, curious to see what someone called green peas could look like. Some people would get the name of the plant wrong and call her edamame or soromame, whereupon she would gently correct them. No, I'm not soybeans or fava beans, just green peas. Pretty close though. Aomame. How many times in her 30 years had she heard the same remarks, the same feeble jokes about her name? My life might have been totally different if I hadn't been born with this name. If I had had an ordinary name like Sato, or Tanaka, or Suzuki, I could have lived a slightly more relaxed life, or looked at people with somewhat more forgiving eyes. Perhaps. Eyes closed, Aomame listened to the music, allowing the lovely unison of the brasses to sink into her brain. Just then it occurred to her that the sound quality was too good for a radio in a taxicab, despite the rather low volume at which it was playing. The sound had true depth, and the overtones were clearly audible. She opened her eyes and leaned forward to study the dashboard stereo. The jet-black device shone with a proud gloss. She couldn't make out its brand name, but it was obviously high-end, with lots of knobs and switches. The green numerals of the station read out clear against the black panel. This was not the kind of stereo you expected to see in an ordinary ET cab. She looked around at the cab's interior. She had been too absorbed in her own thoughts to notice until now, but this was no ordinary taxi. The high quality of the trim was evident, and the seat was especially comfortable. Above all, it was quiet. The car probably had extra sound insulation to keep noise out, like a soundproofed music studio. The driver probably owned his own cab. Many such owner-drivers would spare no expense on the upkeep of their automobiles. Moving only her eyes, Aomame searched for the driver's registration card, without success. This did not seem to be an illegal unlicensed cab, though. It had a standard taxi meter, which was ticking the proper fare, 2,150 yen so far. Still, the registration card showing the driver's name was nowhere to be found. What a nice car, Aomame said, speaking to the driver's back. So quiet. What kind is it? Toyota Crown Royal Saloon, the driver replied succinctly. The music sounds great in here. It's a very quiet car. That's one reason I chose it. Toyota has some of the best sound insulating technology in the world. Aomame nodded and leaned back in her seat. There was something about the driver's way of speaking that bothered her, as though he were leaving something important unsaid. For example, and this is just one example, his remark on Toyota's impeccable sound insulation might be taken to mean that some other Toyota feature was less than impeccable. And each time he niched a sentence, there was a tiny, but meaningful lump of silence left behind. This lump owed there, enclosed in the car's restricted space like an imaginary miniature cloud, giving Aomame a strangely unsettled feeling. It certainly is a quiet car, Aomame declared, as if to sweep the little cloud away. And the stereo looks especially decisiveness was key when I bought it, the driver said, like a retired STA officer explaining a past military success. I have to spend so much time in here, I want the best sound available. And Aomame waited for what was to follow, but nothing followed. She closed her eyes again and concentrated on the music. She knew nothing about Janacek as a person, but she was quite sure that he never imagined that in 1984 someone would be listening to his composition in a hushed Toyota Crown Royal Saloon on the gridlocked elevated Metropolitan Expressway in Tokyo. Why, though, Aomame wondered, had she instantly recognized the piece to be Janacek's Sinfonietta? And how did she know it had been composed in 1926? She was not a classical music fan, and she had no personal recollections involving Janacek, yet the moment she heard the opening bars, all her knowledge of the piece came to her by re-ex, like a hawk of birds swooping through an open window. The music gave her an odd, wrenching kind of feeling. There was no pain or unpleasantness involved. Just a sensation that all the elements of her body were being physically wrung out. Aomame had no idea what was going on. Could Sinfonietta actually be giving me this weird feeling? Janacek, Aomame said half-consciously, though after the word emerged from her lips, she wanted to take it back. What's that, ma'am? Janacek. The man who wrote this music. Never heard of him. Czech composer. Well, the driver said, seemingly impressed. Do you own this cab? Aomame asked, hoping to change the subject. I do, the driver answered. After a brief pause, he added, "It's all mine. My second one. Very comfortable seats." "Thank you, ma'am." Turning his head slightly in her direction, he asked, "By the way, are you in a hurry?" "I have to meet someone in Shibuya. That's why I asked you to take the expressway." "What time is your meeting?" "4:30, Aomame said. "Well, it's already 3:40 V. You'll never make it." "Is the backup that bad?" "Looks like a major accident up ahead. This is no ordinary Tracey jam. We've hardly moved for quite a while." She wondered why the driver was not listening to Tracey. Reports. The expressway had been brought to a standstill. He should be listening to updates on the taxi driver's special radio station. "You can tell it's an accident without hearing a Tracey report?" Aomame asked. "You can't trust them," he said with a hollow ring to his voice. "They're half-lies. The Expressway Corporation only releases reports that suit its agenda. If you really want to know what's happening here and now, you've got to use your own eyes and your own judgment. And your judgment tells you that we'll be stuck here?" "For quite a while," the driver said with a nod. "I can guarantee you that. When it backs up solid like this, the expressway is sheer hell." "Is your meeting an important one?" Aomame gave it some thought. "Yes, very. I have to see a client." "That's a shame. You're probably not going to make it." The driver shook his head a few times as if trying to ease a stiff neck. The wrinkles on the back of his neck moved like some kind of ancient creature. Half-consciously watching the movement, Aomame found herself thinking of the sharp object in the bottom of her shoulder bag. A touch of sweat came to her palms. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. "There's nothing you can do up here on the expressway, not until we get to the next exit. If we were down on the city streets, you could just step out of the cab and take the subway." "What is the next exit?" "Aikiri. We might not get there before the sun goes down, though." "Before the sun goes down?" Aomame imagined herself locked in this cab until sunset. The Janacek was still playing. Muted strings came to the foreground as if to soothe her heightened anxiety. That earlier wrenching sensation had largely subsided. What could that have been? Aomame had caught the cab near Kinyuta, and told the driver to take the elevated expressway from Yoga. The Ao of Tracey had been smooth at RST, but suddenly backed up just before Sanganjaya, after which they had hardly moved. The outbound lanes were moving any. Only the side headed toward downtown Tokyo was tragically jammed. Inbound expressway number 3 would not normally back up at 3 in the afternoon, which was why Aomame had directed the driver to take it. "Time charges don't add up on the expressway," the driver said, speaking toward his rearview mirror. "So don't let the fare worry you. I suppose you need to get to your meeting, though?" "Yes, of course. But there's nothing I can do about it, is there?" He glanced at her in the mirror. He was wearing pale sunglasses. The way the light was shining in, Aomame could not make out his expression. "Well, in fact, there might be a way. You could take the subway to Shibuya from here, but you'd have to do something a little extreme." "Something extreme?" "It's not something I can openly advise you to do." Aomame said nothing. She waited for more with narrowed eyes. "Look over there. See that turnout just ahead?" he asked, pointing. "See? Near that SO sign." Aomame strained to see through the windshield, until she focused on a space to the left of the two-lane roadway, where broken-down cars could pull over. The elevated roadway had no shoulder, but instead had emergency turnouts at regular intervals. Aomame saw that the turnout was out with a yellow emergency phone box for contacting the Metropolitan Expressway Public Corporation, OCE. The turnout itself was empty at the moment. On top of a building beyond the oncoming lanes there was a big billboard advertising Esso gasoline, with a smiling tiger holding a gas hose. To tell you the truth, there's a stairway leading from the turnout down to street level. It's for drivers who have to abandon their cars in a or earthquake and climb down to the street. Usually only maintenance workers use it. If you were to climb down that stairway, you'd be near a Tokyu Line station. From there, it's nothing to Shibuya. I had no idea these metropolitan expressways had emergency stairs, Aomame said. Not many people do. But wouldn't I get in trouble using it without permission when there's no real emergency? The driver paused a moment. Then he said, I wonder. I don't know all the rules of the corporation, but you wouldn't be hurting anybody. They'd probably look the other way, don't you think? Anyway, they don't have people watching every exit. The Metropolitan Expressway Public Corporation is famous for having a huge STA, but nobody really doing any work. What kind of stairway is it? Kind of like a re-escape. You know, like the ones you see on the backs of old buildings. It's not especially dangerous or anything. It's maybe 3 stories high, and you just climb down. There's a barrier at the opening, but it's not very high. Anybody who wanted to could get over it easily. Have you ever used one of these stairways? Instead of replying, the driver directed a faint smile toward his rearview mirror, a smile that could be read any number of ways. It's strictly up to you, he said, tapping lightly on the steering wheel in time to the music. If you just want to sit here and relax and enjoy the music, I'm any with that. We might as well resign ourselves to the fact that we're not going anywhere soon. All I'm saying is that there are emergency measures you can take if you have urgent business. Aomame frowned and glanced at her watch. She looked up and studied the surrounding cars. On the right was a black Mitsubishi Pajero wagon, with a thin layer of white dust. A bored-looking young man in the front passenger seat was smoking a cigarette, with his window open. He had long hair, a tanned face, and wore a dark red windbreaker. The car's luggage compartment was lead with a number of worn surfboards. In front of him was a gray Saab 900, its dark-tinted windows closed tight, preventing any glimpse of who might be inside. The body was so immaculately polished, you could probably see your face in it. The car ahead was a red Suzuki Alto with a Narama Ward license plate and a dented bumper. A young mother sat gripping the wheel. Her small child was standing on the seat next to her, moving back and forth to dispel its boredom.